Hello everybody and welcome to Insider's Guide. Today we're continuing our discussion of the one and only Palisades Tahoe. We've already covered the bigger Palisades side in episode 46, so this episode will focus solely on Alpine Meadows. Like its sister mountain, Alpine Meadows also offers an excellent skiing experience that rivals the best in the Lake Tahoe region. Even though it's a bit smaller than Olympic Valley, Alpine Meadows still has plenty to talk about, so this episode is split into two parts. We'll cover some background information and the lower mountain in this part, and talk about the more expert-centric pods in part B. So with that, let's begin an insider's guide to Alpine Meadows. Now, before we jump in head first, I already covered several key details like travel logistics, parking, and weather in episode 46A. To keep things concise, I won't repeat that here, so if you haven't watched that video yet, I recommend starting there or watching it right after this. We'll get to the trail map in just a second, but for now, let's go over a bit of background information specific to the Alpine side. During the early season, Treeline Cirque is usually the first major lift to open, and from there the resort expands into the Roundhouse and summit terrain. Scott, Lakeview, and Sherwood are typically the last lifts to open, in that order. Sherwood especially can take some time because its terrain faces dead south. If you happen to show up to Palisades Tahoe on a storm day, it's likely that the upper mountain of both sides will be shut due to wind. Over on this Alpine side, Treeline Cirque and maybe Roundhouse are your primary lifts on such days. Once the weather clears up, the resort will gradually reopen the remaining lifts, although some of the hike to extremes can take several days to reopen due to avalanche mitigation. As we previously mentioned in episode 46A, the Alpine side unfortunately closes in April these days, which wasn't the case a few years back. However, the spring skiing experience up until that point really is excellent. One last thing to note is that contrary to the Palisades side, Alpine is a mountain that requires a lot more traversing and exploration to really get a feel for. While we can give a good idea on certain things, there are some areas, whether purposefully or not, that we might miss. Alright, without further ado, let's dive into the mountain itself. Looking here at the base area, note that the lifts are elevated from the parking lot itself, so you will have to walk up a couple flights of stairs. Also note that for whatever reason, the bottom terminal for Summit 6 is a bit of an additional walk from the main lodge. Alpine Meadows' overall beginner experience is a joke, being limited to these two green runs serviced by Subway and Meadow. They are true bunny slopes, so if you're a beginner, I'd head over and check out High Camp and Gold Coast on the Olympic side. Weasel Run and Teagle could reasonably be skied by advanced beginners, but I generally wouldn't recommend Alpine Meadows for true novices. Moving on, the Kangaroo lift here is primarily used by the ski team rather than the general public. It's a long, slow ride that accesses two very average intermediate cruisers. I just wouldn't bother with it unless the rest of the mountain is closed. Let's talk about our first real pod on the mountain, Roundhouse, which is essentially a reliever lift for the summit lift. It's like the Canyon for Sky combo at Heavenly if you're familiar with that. Because Alpine Meadows has a short vertical drop, I rarely ride Roundhouse. Roundhouse can get some decent lines, but those lines are reliably shorter than summits. Thus, on a particularly busy day, if you're looking to lap some nice blues, I would recommend just sticking to Roundhouse. We'll discuss this more in part B, but if things get really out of hand, Roundhouse to Alpine Bowl is a solid option on peak days. Werner's Schuss is a really nice cruiser right off the top of the Roundhouse lift. Boomerang is an alternate run to Werner's Schuss that merges into Charity. Both runs maintain a solid pitch up until you reach the intersection of East Runout and Kangaroo Ridge. It doesn't look like you can reach Kangaroo Ridge from Roundhouse, but I much prefer taking it as it's a lot less traffic than the often heavily congested East Runout, although the latter does have some nice side hits on the skier's right side of the trail. Note that East Runout takes you back to Roundhouse and West Runout takes you to the summit lift. Hitting the wrong one may put you in a spot that requires some walking to get back to where you want, so be careful here. Moving back to the top of Roundhouse, this Sympathy Face run is one of the more underlooked parts of Alpine. It's a steep gladed face with a few rocks and cliffs strewn about. Although it's a bit short, it's a really fun lap, especially if you link it with Gunner's Knob a bit further down. If you go straight for a bit off the top of the Roundhouse lift and then make a hard left, you'll merge onto Rock Garden, which mainly serves as a road to reach these lower cruisers. The trail map does a really poor job of depicting this, but if you stay hard skiers left, you'll reach Charity, my favorite cruiser off Roundhouse. Charity is one of the steeper blues off Roundhouse, and it serves as an excellent warm-up lap for carving enthusiasts. Just a bit skiers right of Charity is Banana Chute, which is a fun little natural halfpipe. Back to Rock Garden, if you continue straight but stay just skiers right of the top terminal of the yellow chair, you'll be on Dance Floor, a short little run that almost always has moguls. The remaining blue runs here filter down into the yellow pod. Just beyond Dance Floor is Gunner's Knob, an awesome lower mountain area that's lightly graded and features a few small cliffs, chutes, and even some straight lines based on conditions. You'll know you're in the right area if you see an old sign warning you about explosives, hence the name. As we mentioned earlier, Sympathy Face to Gunner's Knob is one of the best laps on this part of the mountain, and is really the only major non-groomer run here. Let's shift gears a little bit and talk about the newest lift at Alpine Meadows, Treeline Cirque, sometimes shortened to just TLC. This lift has been a game changer ever since its installation. It mostly follows the same alignment as the old Hot Wheels lift that it replaced, but now includes a mid-unload and then continues to the top of the ridge. As you can see on the map, it allows you to access the Sherwood pod straight from the base, along with a bunch of advanced and expert terrain you used to have to take multiple lifts to lap. TLC, as evidenced by its name, is also a more sheltered ride than some of the others at Alpine. As such, this is usually one of the first lifts to reopen on storm days, and is where I spend most of my time on such days when Summit and Sherwood are closed. On days where every lift is open, Treeline Cirque, for some reason, sees much less crowding than Summit and even Roundhouse. As such, if you're just looking to get up the mountain as quickly as possible, this is definitely the lift I recommend taking. In the early season, when there's less of a base, lift-ups will require you to get off at the mid-station, so just keep that in mind. Let's first talk about all the runs accessed off the mid-station. Weasel Run is essentially the main artery in this whole area. As you'd probably expect given the nature of this run, it gets super congested. It's probably the single busiest area on the mountain. As such, I try to avoid it as much as possible. My favorite way to do so is to cut skiers left into Hot Wheels Gully, a really fun natural halfpipe that actually has a few tricky entrances depending on where you drop in. It's overall a super fun run, although it can get quite fast, and as such, a bit sketchy if you're not confident. Over on the other side here, Skateboard Alley is another natural halfpipe, but is a bit less traffic than Hot Wheels. All of these runs filter down to this mid-mountain hub. Here, this chalet is always busy, so it can be difficult to get seating, but it's a great place to be on days with nice weather. It's also nice because it lets you stop in for a break without having to venture all the way down to the base. For a more traditional day lodge, you'll have to head back down to the base lodge, where you'll find a lot more seating and food options. To do that, you'll have to take Teagle, which is ultra flat until it reaches the terrain park. Try and minimize the amount of times you have to take this run. Before we continue our discussion of Treeline Cirque, let's briefly talk about the Yellow Lift. Both Yellow Trail and Lady Slalom are pretty consistently groomed, while Fall Line is typically left ungroomed. Scattered around the Yellow Lift line are a handful of decently sized cliff drops. Upper Weasel 1 allows you to access the Alpine Bowl Chair, which we'll talk about more in the next part, in addition to this larger terrain park and the uppermost entrance into Hot Wheels Gully. If you continue down Weasel 1, though, it merges with Weasel Run and the rest of the TLC pod. Regarding the Yellow Lift itself, I hardly ever ride it, as all of its terrain is lappable via the Roundhouse lift, which is a much better alternative. However, this can be a nice secluded escape on days when the rest of the mountain gets quite crowded, provided you're okay riding a fixed grip. Moving up to the top of Treeline Cirque, Arts Knob is a technical, cliff-riddled area with some tight chutes defined by trees and rocks. The lines here get more and more technical the further skiers left you go. Just skiers right of Arts is the much wider and often bumped up Expert Shortcut. Hidden Knolls is essentially the TLC lift line and is steep and mogulled. Shifting briefly to the backside trail map, the only intermediate way down from the Treeline Cirque summit requires the Sherwood pod to be open. You essentially ski down Sherwood Run and take Return Road all the way back to Weasel Run. If you didn't gather, that's far from the best run. Shifting back to the frontside trail map, Sherwood Cliffs is a decently gnarly area that features several tight chutes, cliffs, and trees. This area can be particularly sharky in the early season. In most cases, you are allowed to take the brief 2-minute walk from the top of Treeline Cirque to the top of Sherwood, which allows you to access even more expert lines. I actually recommend doing this rather than skiing all the way down to Sherwood, as it saves a lot of time in most cases. There's actually a plethora of chutes and cliffs located in between the marked Sherwood Cliffs and Counterweight Gully runs. I definitely recommend scoping out this area from the bottom of the Alpine Bowl Chair if it's your first time skiing here. Counterweight Gully is an excellent little shot located right off the top of Sherwood. This is actually a great first double black to try at Alpine, as there's very little exposure and the run isn't too narrow or long. In addition, you can also take this Our Father traverse to access the majority of High Yellow Gully, which we'll talk more about in the next part. Directly underneath Our Father is an unnamed chute I've heard called Our Father Chute. This is very technical and tight, requiring exceptionally precise turns. All of these expert lines filter to the bottom of the Alpine Bowl chair, and from there you can take Weasel Run all the way back to the base for another lap. Moving a bit further down the mountain, the Scott Chair is, to me, one of the most underrated lifts in all of Palisades Tahoe. If you're looking to get away from the lines, this is your lift, as it's almost always a walk-on. Most of the runs here are very steep, ungroomed, and maintain their pitch quite well. There are also some really gnarly pockets hidden around if you know where to look. The primary downside here is the snow quality, which can become variable due to the sun aspect. The marquee run here is, of course, Scott Chute. Scott Chute is a very steep line that runs directly under the chair and features several rocks, cliffs, and shrubs scattered throughout. The area between Scott Chute and Chute that seldom slides is very technical, home to a variety of cliff drops, tight trees, and chutes. The most notable line here is known as Murphy's Mistake. Chute that seldom slides is essentially an easier version of Scott Chute and is a great way to work your way up to that run. It's a bit less steep and features some of the obstacles that Scott Chute has. Scott Ridge is the main intermediate run in the Scott Pod and is a decent cruiser. Moving to the looker's left side of the lift, this is easily the least frequented lift-served area on the mountain. I've honestly only taken a few laps back here myself, and I never saw another person. This area is primarily tree skiing, but there are a few chutes and cliffs scattered around. There's a bunch of terrain back here and none of it's marked. As such, this is a zone that I think is much better for you to explore than for me to try and describe. I will say that there are some insane chutes around this Promised Land area adjacent to this enormous cliff band. In addition, Gentian Gully here is a local favorite. This isn't really an issue with Promised Land or Gentian Gully, but if you traverse closer to the skier's right boundary, you will be forced to ride up the subway bunny chair back to the base. From there, pop up Treeline Cirque to Scott for another lap. Switching over to the backside trail map, our final talking point for today's video is the Lakeview pod. Lakeview is one of the best intermediate pods on the mountain, and while it has the same sun exposure issue as Scott, it is a nice place to take a few laps in the afternoon. For Lakeview, note that the majority of runs filter down onto the looker's left lift maze, so if possible, I'd recommend trying to get over to the looker's right maze. It will almost always be a shorter wait. Here you can see Scott Ridge, which we just talked about. Bobby's Run and Standard Run are essentially alternatives to Scott Ridge and are considered part of the Scott pod rather than Lakeview. Winter Road and Summer Road are the two main ways to get into Lakeview from Scott. However, I'd most recommend getting to Lakeview via Treeline Cirque to Sherwood Run to Riley's Run. The rest of the Lakeview runs are very similar cruisers, although they are a touch short for my liking. My favorite run here is definitely Outer Limits, since it takes a bit of additional sidestepping to reach, which keeps crowds down compared to the rest of the pod. Note that there are some out-of-bounds lines here, known as Outer Limits and Outer Limits. You will see some tracks going in this direction, as it is possible to cut back to the Lakeview lift if you traverse at the right time. However, it's very easy to miss the traverse out, and if you want to do this, I'd highly recommend doing it with someone experienced in the area. Alright, that about wraps it up for the front side and Lakeview. Now go check out part B, all about the Summit and Sherwood areas. A shout out to Sneaky Shadoo 22 for correctly guessing the mystery run in the Premium Passes video. If you want to get shouted out just like this, keep an eye out for mystery runs and guess them down below. As always, please leave any questions down below. If you enjoyed this video or found it helpful, please consider subscribing to help support this dream. Thank you all so much for watching. All my love, I'm out.